The framers considered the separation of powers to be the great protection of liberty. In Federalist number 47, James Madison wrote, "The accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. The preservation of liberty requires that the three great departments of power should be separate and distinct." And just a few days later, in what we now call Federalist number 51, Madison also wrote, "Separate and distinct exercise of the different powers of government is essential to the preservation of liberty." The framers understood human nature, and this understanding impelled them to be cautious in the distribution of government powers. Here again, from Federalist 51, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place oblige it to control itself. So, should we keep the powers of government separate? And how separate, if the answer to that question is yes, how separate is separate enough?" Well, one objection I encountered when I was in the ex-Soviet Union and trying to give some of this advice and show some of these constitutional types of principles went directly to the heart of the matter. And it went something like this: separated powers are inefficient. We don't need inefficiency right now. We need efficient government. Won't separate powers inhibit our ability to meet our needs? Well, the honest answer to that question is yes. It will. But the former Soviet Union itself showed what happens when state powers are not separated. Here again, consider the Soviet Constitution. Article 2. "The people exercise state power through the Soviets of People's Deputies, which constitute the political foundation of the USSR. All other state bodies are under the control of and accountable to the Soviets of People's Deputies." Was that efficient in the exercise of government power? Absolutely. But that is also the very definition of tyranny, and it's hard to see that in theory. We can certainly see it in practice in the ex-Soviet Union. So, we give up a measure of efficiency for what we hope is the best deterrent to tyranny. Now, one important aspect of contemporary constitutionalism is a strong and independent judiciary. Through the so-called non-political branch, individuals can enforce their rights against encroachments by the government. Of course, the judiciary doesn't create individual rights, but it provides a means for individuals to protect their rights. Courts exercise judgment. They don't legislate. They don't execute laws. They simply declare the meaning of the laws in specific cases. And they declare the constitutionality of the acts of the other two branches of government. Now let me say, it is virtually impossible to create an absolute separation of powers of government. And the American Constitution itself certainly does no such thing. The president has a veto power over legislation. Well, that's not separated powers right there. The vice president sits as president of the Senate, and occasionally, not very often, occasionally may vote in Congress. That's not separated completely. Congress has the power of ratification of treaties, and the Senate must be consulted by the president on judicial appointments. The genius of the American constitutional framework consists in the founders' understanding that to be effective, a constitution must not simply be a theoretical aspiration, but also must be practical. Here again, let me make reference to the Federalist Papers, number 73. Alexander Hamilton recognized, quote, the insufficiency of a mere parchment delineation of the boundaries delineating the separation of powers. Hence, they created a system of supplying opposite and rival interests that the private interest of every individual may be a sentinel over the public rights and thereby provide the necessary protection against excessive concentration of power in any one body or person. Thomas Jefferson wrote that the natural progress of things is for liberty to yield and government to gain ground. Now let's be clear. We must have government. But let's also be clear that government is the greatest threat to liberty. Well, the American Constitution is an attempt at reaching a balance between effective government and the protection of liberty. It's not the only way of achieving that balance. Others, with different societal histories, may try to reach a different equilibrium. But to be a government of laws and not of men, that is, for the rule of law to prevail, any nation must separate the powers of government. Now, we've discussed the separation of powers within the central government. I call this the horizontal separation of powers. But what about a vertical separation of powers? If separating the powers of the central government is a great protection against tyranny, wouldn't separating the powers between the central government on the one hand and the regional and local governments, or as we say here, state and local governments, on the other hand, provide additional protections? That was the question, should we have a unitary state or a federal one? Well, as you know, our country has a federal system. Separate sovereign states banded together to form a central government. The states retain their sovereignty, though they have given up a measure of that sovereignty in hopes of fulfilling the promises of the preamble. What do you think of the word federalism? I have a guess that you probably don't think about it too often. You take it for granted. We all do. You understand it isn't the only means of organizing government, but you wouldn't react strongly to the word one way or the other. Yet when I mentioned the word federalism in the ex-Soviet Republic of Moldova in 1993, you might have thought I had just called for the violent overthrow of the government, just from using that word. While in Moldova, a tiny country of, interestingly enough, this number keeps cropping up here, about 3.5 million, sandwiched between Ukraine and Romania, I led a 2-week-long seminar on constitutionalism. Attendees included leading government and community officials from Moldova, including some representing a breakaway area called Transnistria. Only months earlier, there had been a brief but bloody civil war in which several hundred people lost their lives. Now, consider about a couple weeks long war in Oklahoma where you have 700-800 people being killed, and you get the magnitude of this. This was a pretty big thing. The Russian 14th Army, then as now, still stationed in Transnistria, was enforcing the ceasefire. The speech I gave on federalism was so controversial that the next evening, when I prepared to discuss the horizontal separation of powers, government officials sent in so-called observers, thuggish-looking people, these were former KGB agents, meant to intimidate, or to put it more bluntly, to shut down dissent. Many used the opportunity to rail against federalism, others issuing harsh demands that the seminar sponsors no longer even mention the concept. Isn't free speech great? We say harsh things against our government and government leaders all the time, and we do so without fear of reprisal. A few years ago, I appeared on national television and used some rather harsh words about the President of the United States. Actually, called him cowardly. So a few months later, when I debated a civil libertarian who perhaps overzealously believed the government was trying to curtail dissent, I responded by citing my own example and stating that it frankly never even occurred to me that anyone with the government would do anything against me. Now, I will say this, I wasn't expecting any favors from the government from the president after that, and I don't think I was going to get any. Debate federalism? Well, we do this type of thing all the time. Criticize the president, governor, senators, speaker of the House. That's what we do. We take it for granted, as we should. The world observes us and aspires to have the same rights that we have. Must a modern democratic state have federalism? No, and plenty of them do not. But federalism is a concept that can help a diverse nation both come together and protect against encroachments. So what do we have? We have some universal principles which can apply anywhere. Power comes from the people. Residual power resides in the people. The people create a government. I'd like to say this is a universal, not just in principle, but in application. It's not. The people create government not for the benefit of those who rule, but for their own benefit, to protect against encroachments on their liberties. The American Constitution is a remarkable document. It's well worth studying, only 11 pages long. It's not that long. And actually some of the large page or so of those 11 pages are taken up with things that have been removed from the document. It doesn't take long to read. It doesn't take long to study. It's well worth studying. I would gladly feel going to any place that while perhaps that document is not the document that somebody else should adopt, it is something that one can look at and emulate and use, pick and choose the broad, hopefully most of those broad principles that we have in that remarkable document that was signed 223 years ago today. I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.